Without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Professor Greg Gause's teaching and research interests are in international relations and Middle Eastern politics. He is the author of a number of articles and 3 books: The International Relations of the Persian Gulf, published by Cambridge University Press in 2010, Oil Monarchies, Domestic and Security Challenges in the Arab Gulf States, Council on Foreign Relations Press, 1994, and Saudi-Yemeni Relations, Domestic Structures and Foreign Influence, Columbia University Press, 1990. His articles have appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Security Studies, Middle East Journal, Washington Quarterly, Journal of International Affairs, Review of International Studies, and in other journals and edited volumes. Before joining the Political Science Department at the University of Vermont, he was a member of the faculty of Columbia University. He holds a PhD degree from Harvard University, and I cannot think of a more apropos, wonderful speaker. Professor Gause.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out on the first day of real spring in Vermont. Let's hope it continues. So what I want to do tonight is disabuse you of the notion that what's happening in the Middle East is a fight between Sunnis and Shia. Or at least that that's not the best way to think about it. Obviously, all sorts of people who are Sunnis and all sorts of people who are Shia are fighting each other in various places. But I think that if we look at the region and say Sunni-Shia conflict, we're missing a lot of the subtleties, we're missing a lot of the dynamics, and I think that there's a better framework for understanding this, which I'm going to try to sell you tonight, the new Middle East Cold War. Right? So what do we mean by a Cold War? Well, the classic historic Cold War was the United States and the Soviet Union, and no, we're not starting a new one with Mr. Putin, despite what you might read in some overheated publications. The classic Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was a war. Lots of people died. There were lots of physical conflicts, but it was a Cold War because the two main protagonists, the United States and the Soviet Union, never fired a single shot at each other. They conducted their contest for influence in the domestic politics of what we used to call third world states. At the beginning of the Cold War, they conducted that contest for influence in the domestic politics of European states. But after the solidification of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, they conducted that Cold War largely through supporting clients and allies who were struggling to control the uncertain politics of countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So it was cold in that the two major powers didn't actually fight a war with one another. It was a war because there was a lot of wars fought. Right? And it was a contest for influence played out in the domestic politics of weaker states. I think that's exactly what's happening in the Middle East today. Saudi Arabia and Iran, who are the two major, although not the only, protagonists in this Cold War, right, are not going to fire shots at one another. Nobody thinks the Iranian army and the Saudi army are going to square off on a battlefield, and that the Iranian and Saudi Air Force are going to fight dogfights against each other in the sky. However, Saudi Arabia and Iran are fighting for influence, are fighting to direct the future of the region. And they are doing it by supporting clients and allies who themselves are fighting in the domestic politics of weak states in the Arab world. And when I say weak states, I don't necessarily mean weak in the way we think of it, weak internationally, with a weak army. Kuwait is a very weak state. Any of its neighbors, as we saw in 1990, could basically roll into Kuwait, and take it over. Iraq took about 12 hours to take over the whole country. By weak states, though, I mean states that are weak in terms of the government's control and links to their society. Kuwait is not a weak state by that definition. The government controls its borders, polices its territory, and has decent relations with its citizens, who, despite disputes with the government and with each other, still see their primary loyalty as being to the state of Kuwait. So in fact, Kuwait, by my definition, for purposes tonight, is a strong state. But there's a lot of weak states in the Arab world, in the Eastern Arab world right now, that are the playing fields for this new Middle Eastern Cold War. Right? We'll get into the details. Sorry, we'll get into the details this in a minute. But if we consider the Eastern Arab world, Iran, Turkey, right, we're talking about states that where the government doesn't control its borders, has very weak control over society, doesn't have the classic Weberian definition of statehood, a near monopoly on the legitimate use of force. We're talking about places like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, the Palestinian territories, Yemen. We could add in Libya. Places where there are governments, but those governments don't govern. They don't control their societies. These are the playing fields of the new Middle East Cold War. All right, so I'm calling it a new Middle East Cold War. That must mean there was an old Middle East Cold War. And there was. All right. As I look out in the audience tonight, I see at least one or two people who might remember this guy, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt from 1954 to his death in 1970. Nasser, as one or two of you may remember, was the leader of the Pan-Arab movement that called for the unification of Arab states. And he actually pulled it off at one point, briefly for 3 years, uniting Egypt and Syria together in what he called the United Arab Republic. Nasser, through force of personality, ideas, and technology, was able to appeal to people in other Arab states over the head of their leaders. Appeal to those people to support him and not the leaders of their own states. And he shook governments and helped bring governments down. He helped bring down the Iraqi monarchy. He helped bring down the Yemeni monarchy. He brought down not only the Syrian government in 1958, but Syrian sovereignty in 1958. He shook governments in Lebanon and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. The fight between Nasser and the quote-unquote progressives, the self-described progressives that he led, and the reactionaries, as he labeled his opponents in the pro-Western monarchies like Saudi Arabia and Jordan, right, dominated the politics of the Middle East from the mid-1950s to the 1967 war. The late Malcolm Kerr famously called this era of Middle Eastern politics the Arab Cold War. I'm very consciously appropriating that title, but calling it a Middle Eastern Cold War because Iran is one of the major protagonists. And if you say that Iran is an Arab country, you automatically flunk my course. There's very few things you can do to automatically flunk. But if you call Iran or Turkey an Arab, kids don't call Israel an Arab country. They've got that one. But Iran and Turkey, if you call them Arab countries, you automatically flunk the course. Right? So be careful when you ask questions tonight. Iran is a major protagonist in this new Middle East Cold War. Turkey has attempted to become a protagonist and found out the costs of trying to play in this kind of game. We'll talk about that later. Obviously, the central conflict of this new Middle Eastern Cold War these days is Syria. But that's not new either, right? That's not new. The other book that I can recommend to you if you want to understand how the past kind of can illuminate our present conflicts in the Middle East, you should look at The Struggle for Syria by Patrick Seale. Patrick Seale, a British journalist, an author, wrote this book in the 1960s. It was about the struggle within the domestic politics of Syria to direct where the country would go. Right? A struggle that in the end, in 1958, Nasser won. But it was a struggle. And every faction in Syrian domestic politics called on outsiders to help them. Right? And the Syrian state was too weak to fend off those outside interventions. Right? And the people in Syria, or enough of them, had loyalties to entities beyond Syria. Syria, a very new state, a state that called itself the beating heart of Arabism, a place where Arab nationalism and Arab unity, at least in that period, was a belief widely held. So what we're seeing in the new Middle East Cold War is not new. It has enormously important analogs to the politics of the 50s and the 60s. And I always tell my students that reading these two books can probably teach you more about what's going on today than anything else. So I've talked about some of these similarities, and I always hate it when people read their slides. So I'm just going to let you have at that. But there is one thing that I want to emphasize from this slide. And that is the fact that in any Cold War, there's a main axis of conflict. But it's not the only axis of conflict. Think about the historical Cold War, the classic Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. Yes, the United States and the Soviets were the main protagonists. But there was also an enormously important conflict within the communist bloc itself, between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. Right? A conflict within the communist bloc that became so intense that it led to the breaking of that bloc, right? And the de facto alignment of China with the United States for the last 20 years almost of the Cold War. In the old Arab Cold War, similarly, while the progressives versus the reactionaries, the pro-Soviets versus the pro-Americans, the republics versus the monarchies was the main axis of conflict, it wasn't the only one. Because when the Iraqi monarchy fell to a military coup, very similar to the Egyptian military coup that overthrew the Egyptian monarchy, the guy who emerged as the leader of Iraq, a guy named Abdul Karim Qasim, everybody expected him to join the UAR, to join with Syria and Egypt in a single state because, you know, it was Arab nationalism and Arab unity that made this revolution. But Qasim said, well, wait a minute, I like this idea of Arab unity, but I'm not so sure that Nasser should be the leader. Maybe I should be the leader. And there was an intense struggle among the quote-unquote progressives between Nasser and Qasim for leadership of that bloc in the old Arab Cold War. Likewise today, there are multiple conflict axes. Right? The one we hear the most about, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Sunni Shia. But there's also a severe political conflict going on within Sunni Islam to define what Islam means for politics in the Sunni world between Saudi Arabia roughly on one side and the Muslim Brotherhood on another. And I'll talk about that conflict as we go on also.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Much as I really appreciate your comment about hating people who read around the slides,
yes.
Unfortunately, it's not always, from where I'm sitting, it's not possible to see the lower pieces on the slide. So.
Oh, that's a shame. Okay, we'll try to. Can you see this picture of this guy? You see, all right, stand up in the back if you can't see him. We're going to talk about him in a minute, all right? So in every Cold War, right, because military versus military fighting isn't the driver, right? It's not, amassed armies fighting each other in classic battles. There are paradoxes of power, right? One of the real paradoxes of the new Middle East Cold War is that the most powerful state militarily in the Middle East has almost no role in the new Middle East Cold War, and that's Israel. Right? The Israelis, no one would contest the fact that the Israelis are the best army in the Middle East. Right? They haven't lost a war in a long time, although they've fought some to ties. But if you look around the new Middle East Cold War, you hardly see any influence for Israel. The Israelis tried to play this kind of game. They tried to play into the domestic politics of Arab states in the past, right? Most notably in 1982 when they invaded Lebanon and tried to restructure the politics of Lebanon, right, in a way that would produce a Lebanese government that would be friendly to them. It was an utter failure. And Israelis have judged it a failure and have basically decided, we're not going to play this game. Right? They can't really play this game because they've got bayonets, but as Bismarck supposedly and famously said, you can do everything with a bayonet except sit on it. Right? They've got the bayonets, but they don't have those connections to play into the politics of the other. They don't have patrons. They don't have clients. They don't have allies, ideological or political, who can play into the politics of Syria, who can play into the politics of Lebanon, who can play into the politics of Iraq. They don't have them. It's not to say that the Israelis aren't concerned about what's going on. They're very concerned. They're also kind of divided. They don't like Bashar al-Assad, but at least he was a guy they knew, and they had experience with his regime, his father and then him. They don't know if they like the rebels either, right? So they haven't picked a side. They know they don't like Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? And they tried to do away with them in 2006 and failed. Once again, you can do everything with a bayonet except sit on it. Right? Because the Israelis can't play into the politics of Lebanon because they have no allies, they have no clients, they have no ideological fellows, right, who will support their interests. They can't play into this Middle East Cold War. Now, if it turns into a hot war, they'll play plenty. Right? But they can't play into the Cold War. Compare them to Qatar. This tiny little nubbin of a country sticking out from the Arabian Peninsula. Right? I don't know if we should maybe go back. Whoops. There's Qatar, right there. Right? Qatar, might have 400,000 or 500,000 citizens population. It's the richest country in the world per capita, right? But it doesn't have an army to speak of. It's not a military power to speak of. But it is playing in the new Middle East Cold War because it has money, and you can convert money into guns, and you can convert money into political support, and it has an information strategy, right, through its sponsorship of the most widely watched Arabic language news channel, Al Jazeera, which is owned by the Qatari family, Qatari ruling family. And it has allies because the Qatari government has for over a decade been very supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood. So Qatar has actually been playing in this game, even though it's a tiny country with no military power. It has had a greater role in the new Middle East Cold War than Israel, the most powerful military state in the region. Right? Here's another paradox of power. Well, I'll eventually figure out how this works. Is it Iranian military power that gives Iran a role in the new Middle East Cold War, or is it this guy? My contention is it's this guy. That's General Qasem Soleimani. General Soleimani is head of the Quds force. Quds is the Persian and Arabic word for Jerusalem. Right? The Quds force is part of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, right? The ideological military force of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Right? The force created by the Islamic Republican government, Ayatollah Khomeini, on the side of the regular Army, Air Force, Navy, to be the revolutionary, ideologically committed shock troops of the revolution. These guys are now the most important military formation in Iran. General Soleimani, his job, right, is to support Iranian allies throughout the world. The Quds force acts outside of Iran's borders to advance Iran's ideological and geopolitical interests. So General Soleimani has his own forces fighting in Syria to support Bashar al-Assad. Right? General Soleimani has a network of allies and clients in Iraq that fought the United States when we were occupying Iraq and that are supporting the Prime Minister of Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki. And of course, he is Iran's main liaison with Iran's most important regional ally and client, Hezbollah, in Lebanon. General Soleimani, right, conducts Iranian foreign policy at the direction of the Iranian state. His rival in Saudi Arabia, right, there is no General Soleimani in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has to outsource its policy in the new Middle East Cold War. It doesn't have organized ideological allies, right, that are unified and that follow Saudi Arabia's direction. So the Saudis have a lot less control. They pay people and then they don't know what those people are going to do. General Soleimani knows exactly what his people are going to do. Right? It's not Iranian military power that gives Iran an important role, if not a leading role, in this new Middle Eastern Cold War. Right? It's not the regular army. Nobody I've talked to in Saudi Arabia actually fears that the Iranian army is going to invade them. It's General Soleimani, right, who is the reason or the face of Iranian power in this new Middle Eastern Cold War. All right. Is this a Sunni-Shia conflict? I told you at the beginning I want to say no, it's not. It's not a Sunni-Shia conflict. That's not the best framework for understanding it. What's my evidence for that? Because, without a doubt, Sunnis and Shia are killing each other in Lebanon and in Iraq, right? It's a little more complicated in Syria, right? Which I'll point to in a minute. Well, first off, this Sunni-Shia thing doesn't describe everybody who's playing this game. There are the Kurds. The Kurds are not a sectarian group. They are an ethnic group, right? They speak a different language, Kurdish. Right? There are Sunni Kurds and there are Shia Kurds in Iraq and Syria. But their Kurdish identity is stronger than their, politically stronger than their sectarian identity. And the Kurds gang together and have very successfully formed a de facto independent state in northern Iraq, the Kurdish regional government. Lebanese Christians play in this game, and they're split. Some of the Lebanese Christians are with the pro-Iranian guys. Some of the Lebanese Christians are with the pro-Saudi guys. And perhaps the most interesting bit of evidence for me, and I think the most persuasive, is to put this in a Sunni-Shia context, you have to make the Alawi minority in Syria Shia. And that's just wrong. Right? The Alawis, right, the religious minority from which Bashar al-Assad and many of the security officials of his regime hail, right, make up about 12 to 15% of the Syrian population. They are an offshoot of Shiism, very heterodox. If you lined up 100 Shia ayatollahs, 100 Shia men of religion, Shia clerics, and you asked them, are the Alawis Shia? 97 of them would say no. The origins of the Syrian-Iranian alliance that occurred when the revolution succeeded and threw the Shah out in 1979 had nothing to do with religion. It had everything to do with two common enemies, Israel and Saddam Hussein. Those two common enemies helped to solidify a strategic relationship between the most secular government in the Arab world at that time, the Syrian Ba'athist regime, which in the early 1980s, when this alliance with Iran was being solidified, were killing their own Muslim brothers. Right? The most secular regime in the Arab world with an Islamic revolutionary regime. Right? And it had nothing to do with the fact that the Alawis were somehow Shia. It had everything to do with regional geopolitics. Right? But with this upsurge in sectarianism, which is real, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, right? It was just easy to fit this in. Oh, they're Alawis, they're an offshoot of Shiism, so they're Shia, and this is part of the Shia alliance. No, I don't think that that has anything, frankly, to do with why the Iranians are supporting Bashar al-Assad's regime. So, both Saudi and Iran, right, who play the sectarian card when it suits their purposes, right? Neither of these players in this game are good or right or on the side of the angels, okay? Both of them deny up and down that they're fighting a sectarian war. They always blame the other one for bringing sectarianism in. Now, this might be the famous definition of hypocrisy, right? The homage that vice pays to virtue. But it's interesting that both sides in this new Middle Eastern Cold War want to deny that they're driven by sectarianism. Right? They must think that people don't like that. And I think in general, most people in the Muslim world don't like sectarian fights. And in both cases, the Saudis and the Iranians have both transcended the Sunni-Shia divide to find allies. Right? For Iran, right, the last major state in the Middle East that kind of waves the banner of the anti-Israeli sentiment, right? Those allies are with Palestinian groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, who are not Shia groups, they're Sunni groups, right, but share Iran's hostility to Israel. The Saudis, right, were the major funders of the Iraqiyya Party, one of the major political parties in Iraq, headed up by a guy named Iyad Alawi. Right? Alawi is a Shia. Now, he's not a religious man. He's a completely secular man. Right? But there were plenty of sectarian Sunni parties in the Iraqi elections of 2005 and 2010 that the Saudis could have backed. They didn't. They backed Alawi. And he actually won the 2010 election. Right? He got 91 seats in the Iraqi parliament, and the current prime minister's party, Nouri al-Maliki, got 89 seats. So how did Maliki get to hold on to power? Because the Iranians came in and told their allies to back Maliki. Guess what? In the end, we, Washington, also basically said, yeah, we'll support Maliki too. But the Saudis put their money behind not a Sunni cleric or a Sunni sectarian, but a guy who ran an explicitly non-sectarian Iraqi nationalist list that had Sunnis, that had Shia, that had Kurds, that had everybody. And finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I'll talk about a little in a couple of minutes, the severe tensions within the Sunni world between the Muslim Brothers in Saudi Arabia and their various allies gives the lie to the idea that this is simply a Sunni-Shia conflict. So, now that we've established that that's the wrong framework, why do we see so much sectarian feeling in the region? Whoops, wrong way. I'll figure this out eventually. Well, the greener you are, the more Shia you are. Okay? Iran, right? Huge 90% majority Shia population. Iraq, 60, 55% Shia in there. The only other country in the Middle East where there's a Shia majority is Bahrain, tiny little island off the coast of Saudi Arabia. Lebanon has a Shia plurality in that mosaic of sectarian groups that make up Lebanon, Muslims and Christians with their own internal divisions. Right? The Shia are the largest demographic group, but not a majority. And there's a Shia population in Yemen as well, although not a majority. Much smaller minorities in other Middle Eastern states. Right? So the Iranians, if they say we're fighting for the Shia, their influence is limited, and they don't want to limit their influence. Right? That's why they've always been at the head of what they call the axis of resistance against Israel, against the United States. Right? That's why Ayatollah Khomeini, right, every speech he gave on this subject before he died said, you know, there is no Sunni Shia, we are all Muslims, and this is a Muslim revolution, it's not a Shia revolution. Right? I just like that map, that's why I put it up. So, where does sectarianism come from in this? It comes from the weakness of central governance. Right? It comes from the weakness of central governance. If the state cannot provide for the basic, fundamental elements of order and security that states are supposed to provide, where are you going to go to find that? If the state can't keep order, if the state can't protect you, if the state can't provide a basic, minimal level of services to you, you're going to find it somewhere else. You're going to find it in a community that makes you feel safe, to which you feel a sense of belonging, it's like home. It's the place where if you show up, they can't throw you out, right? And in many parts of the Arab world, for various historical reasons that we don't have the hours and hours to explain tonight, right, those communities are sectarian. Not everywhere. In Libya, they're tribal and regional. In Egypt, they're ideological. Right? In Yemen, they're tribal and regional, not really sectarian. But in Lebanon, in Palestine, they're ideological. Among the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, they're ideological splits. But in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, those historical disputes have been sectarian, with the Kurds thrown in. A little bit of ethnic dispute, too, there in Syria and Iraq. But the core divisions of society have been sectarian. And so when state authority breaks down in places where, for historical reasons, core political identities tend to be sectarian, you're going to get sectarian fighting. Right. Now, the weakness and breakdown of state authority is what invites regional intervention. It's what creates the new Middle East Cold War. This didn't start with the Arab Spring. Lebanon, Yemen, historically weak states, historically the playgrounds of the regional powers. Right? Every single major Middle Eastern power has intervened in Lebanese politics over the last 50 years, sometimes directly militarily, sometimes politically. And they don't have to force themselves in because there's plenty of Lebanese who are asking them to come in to support them, these Lebanese, against their Lebanese domestic opponents. Yemen is also a place where the state has historically been weak and outsiders have played in. Whether it was Nasser sending troops in the 1960s to support the revolutionary regime that overthrew the monarchy, whether it's Saudi Arabia today buying tribes, buying politicians in the Yemeni political system in order to try to direct the way it goes, right? But what makes a Cold War, right, is not a few small marginal countries where the state is weak and outsiders play in. It's the multiplication of those playing fields. And that's what we've seen in the 2000s. Again, it doesn't begin with the Arab Spring. I think that the new Middle East Cold War really begins in 2003. When the United States invades Iraq. Right? The United States, as a matter of policy, destroyed the Iraqi state. Right? was a conscious decision on our part to destroy the three pillars of the modern authoritarian third world state. The ruling party, the Ba'ath Party, we made it illegal. Right? The army, we disbanded it, and the bureaucracy. We gutted it by saying anybody who had a certain rank in the Ba'ath Party couldn't have a bureaucratic role in the future. Well, being part of the Ba'ath in Iraq was like being part of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. You had to join the party to move up. So basically we erased, right, a large number of the skilled cadres who could actually run a government in Iraq. Now, we did that really well. Okay? We did that really well. We're really good at that. What we weren't good at is the next task, which is rebuilding the Iraqi state. We failed at that. By doing that, we opened up Iraqi politics. Right? Saddam Hussein had weakened the Iraqi state through stupid foreign policy. Right? The international community had weakened the Iraqi state through the most severe regime of economic sanctions ever imposed in the modern world. And then we, the United States, broke it open, right, in 2003. Iraq, which had been a player in regional politics, becomes a playing field. And who is best positioned to play into Iraqi politics? Iran. Long border, Shia majority in Iraq, historic ties. Iran, revolutionary Iran having cultivated relations with Iraqi Shia groups since the revolution, right, from 1979. And thus, when the Saudis say, you Americans handed Iraq to Iran on a silver platter, which the Saudi foreign minister said a couple of years ago, 2007, I think, in a speech at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, he was not wrong. He was not wrong. In 2007, you get the split between Fatah and Hamas in the Palestinian territories. This also opens up an area for Iran, right? As Hamas looks for allies. Saudi Arabia tried to bring Fatah and Hamas together. The U.S. didn't like that because we don't like Hamas. We tried to bring Fatah and Hamas together. The Saudis did. Failed utterly. Right? They start fighting each other. The Iranians come in and ally with Hamas. Then the Arab Spring adds more playing fields to the game. Syria, most importantly. That's why, for the Saudis, Syria is so important. The Saudis had basically been losers in this new Middle East Cold War. They had lost in Lebanon, Hezbollah, the dominant force. The Saudis backed what's called the March 14th coalition in Lebanon, which won 2 elections in Lebanon, formed the governments, but couldn't bring Hezbollah under control. Right? Saudis lost in Lebanon. Saudis lost in Iraq. Right? Their friend Iyad Alawi doesn't get to be prime minister. Saudis lost in Palestine with the breakup of the Fatah-Hamas deal that King Abdullah himself personally negotiated. That's why Syria became so important for them, because for them, Syria was going to be the one chance to roll back Iranian influence in the Arab world. Syria, Sunni majority state, right? Civil war. Right? Let's roll these guys out. And that's why the Saudis are so frustrated with us, because they don't think we're helping to do that. Sectarianism. Oh, I want to say Libya. You can add Libya to the list. Libya is far from Iran. There's no Shia there. But as we'll see, I think Libya is going to become the next battleground of this new Middle Eastern Cold War as intra-Sunni groups fight it out there. So for me, sectarianism is bottom-up. It's not top-down. It's not the Iranians and the Saudis going and saying, right, we're going to have a Sunni-Shia fight, and we're going to pick the Sunnis, and the Iranians are going to pick the Shia, and we're going to impose a sectarian notion. No. Sectarianism comes from the bottom up. And when in these fractured societies of Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, Sunnis look for allies, they naturally look to Saudi. When Shia look for allies, they naturally look to Iran. And the Iranians and the Saudis will play that game. But I think that the sectarianism comes from the bottom up, which makes it much, much harder to ratchet it down. If it were all Saudi and Iran, actually I think Saudi and Iran could probably, after a while, they both find out that this is too expensive a game, they could compose their differences. But it's a heck of a lot harder to compose the differences of a real civil war. So, the reason why there's a new Middle Eastern Cold War is that there's a power vacuum here, 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 maybe a power vacuum in the Sinai, and then throw in Libya. Power vacuums draw in external intervention. Iran is extremely well positioned to play in this new Middle Eastern Cold War. First off, it has a long-standing alliance with Hezbollah. This is Hassan Nasrallah. This little guy is the former president of Iran. You might remember him. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Thank heavens his replacement is, well, we'll see how that all works out. But this is Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah. Right? The most powerful political and military force in Lebanese politics. This, of course, is Bashar al-Assad, right? Iran's most important state ally in the Arab world. This is Nouri al-Maliki, the prime minister of Iraq, who owes his continuation in his job to this man, the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei. Extra points if you know who this is. No. Nope. Yeah, whose name is, you only get the points if you come up with the name. No, it's Khalid Mashal. Khalid Mashal is the head of Hamas outside of Gaza. Okay? He looks a little bit like Morsi. His beard's a little grayer. I think Morsi does a little bit of a dye job on his. Maybe not now. This is, the Iranian list of allies. Some of them, there's the sectarian tie. Right? With some of them, it's geostrategic. With some of them, it's the anti-Israeli, playing the anti-Israeli card. But the Iranians are in a good position to play into this new Middle Eastern Cold War because three of the major battlefields, right, are areas where sectarian tensions define the social cleavages when the state breaks down. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. See if there's anything else in that. Okay, that's about right. I said that there's more than one axis of conflict in this. And this one, I think, gets ignored. Not ignored, but it gets downplayed. But it's extremely important. It's extremely important. And that's the fight within the Sunni world, the intra-Sunni axis of the new Cold War. And basically, right, this is created by the victories of the Muslim Brotherhood in the first elections of the Arab Spring. Right? In Tunisia, the Nahda party is basically the Muslim Brotherhood of Tunisia. It wins a plurality of the seats in the Tunisian Parliamentary Constitutional Assembly election in 2011. And then in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood wins almost 50% of the seats in the Egyptian parliamentary elections. And Salafi Islamists win 20% of the seats. So 70% of the seats in the Egyptian parliament are won by Islamists. The Muslim Brotherhood looks like it's going to become the electoral expression of Islamist politics in the Sunni world. Now, the brothers have allies. Qatar, directly funding Muslim Brotherhood groups and the Egyptian government after the Muslim Brotherhood wins. The Qataris aligned themselves with the Muslim Brotherhood some time ago. I asked a Qatari ambassador to the United States once, why do you do this? And he said, they're the wave of the future. Right? They're the wave of the future. Well, not everybody wants them to be the wave of the future. Saudi Arabia, right, sees democratic Islamism in the Sunni world as a challenge. right? It goes against their definition of what Islam means for politics. They don't like the brothers. They think the brothers could be an internal threat within Saudi Arabia. They certainly see them as an external challenge to Saudi leadership of the Sunni Muslim world. And they don't like the brothers. Indirectly, the Brotherhood had a major regional ally in Turkey. The government of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the prime minister, and his Justice and Development Party, the AK party, is the Turkish acronym AKP. He was in the news this weekend, you know, banning Twitter and his party winning the local elections. Big political victory for Erdogan. He's not Arab. Remember, you fail if you say Turks are Arabs. But basically, he's of the same ideological trend as the Muslim Brotherhood, right? Electoral Islamist, electoral Sunni Islamist. Erdogan took a victory tour in the fall of 2011 of Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia, kind of saying, let's get a democratic Islamist bloc together. Erdogan was the first Middle Eastern leader to call for Assad to leave power, even though he had been pretty friendly with Assad before. To some extent, the Turks and the Saudis should be together. They both don't like Assad. They're both worried about the Iranians. But in fact, the Turks and the Saudis are backing different people in Syria. Right? They can't cooperate, particularly against Assad or against Iran. The Saudis have fought back against the Muslim Brotherhood in a number of ways. They've supported rebels in Syria who are not MB, both secularists and Salafis, the long-bearded guys. Interesting that the Saudis, right, the most conservative, most Salafi, were actually the ones supporting the secular fighting groups at the beginning of the Syrian civil war in 2012. Right? Now they've said these secular guys aren't doing the job and they're starting to put money to the really long beards. Although they say not al-Qaeda. But how do you tell the difference? Right? The Saudis and the Emiratis, the United Arab Emirates, incredibly supportive of the military government in Egypt, have promised them $12 billion, have probably delivered about $4 billion of that. Right? They are going to support the military government of Egypt and General Sisi. And just last week, Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Bahrainis started to squeeze Qatar. Took their ambassadors out of Qatar, basically told the Qataris, until you basically get rid of this Muslim Brotherhood stuff, we're isolating you within the region. Right? So if this actually is a Sunni-Shia fight, and I'm sorry, those in the back, because that was the neat bit of PowerPoint. Let's see if we can do that again. That was a neat bit of PowerPoint graphics. If this is a sectarian fight, the Sunnis don't have their act together. Right? They don't have their act together. Right? Because I would argue it's not a sectarian fight, basically. It's a fight about political power, which happens to be sectarian in some contexts, but not in others. All right, last slide. How about us, the U.S.? Where are we in all this thing? So as I said before, we're about a lot. If the long-term solution to the new Middle East Cold War is building stronger states, we've got nothing to contribute. Right? We've got nothing to contribute. We're much better, as I said before, at state destroying than at state building. Right? Now, the thing I hear the most when I go to the Middle East, and I tend to go to the Gulf and the Sunni countries, that's what I study, is that your policy, you're weak and you're inconsistent. Well, yeah. If you view the entire region through the lens of the new Middle East Cold War, we are inconsistent. We are against an Iranian-supported dictatorial regime in Damascus and are supporting, at least somewhat, an opposition to that regime that includes Sunni jihadists. In Iraq, we are supporting an Iranian-supported central government because they're fighting against an opposition that includes Sunni jihadists. We say we're in favor of democracy, but we refuse to call the military coup in Egypt a coup. For very good legal reasons. Because the Leahy Amendment, and we know that name, the Leahy Amendment says that if the United States government finds that an army has conducted a coup against its government, the United States cannot give any military aid to that army. So if we called what happened in Egypt a coup, we would have to cut off military aid. So we don't call it a coup. Right? We can multiply these inconsistencies. But I think they're only inconsistent if that's your view, if you're viewing the region through the lens of this new Middle East Cold War. I don't think that's the way the administration is viewing the region. Right? They don't define their priorities the same way that the Saudis do. Right? The U.S. might want Assad out, but it doesn't care as much as the Saudis do about it. And it's not willing to pay a price. And we've seen that, right? It's not willing to pay a serious price to get rid of Assad because this president just doesn't think Syria is that important. Right? He got into office to wind down American military involvement in the Middle East, not to wind it up. Right? There was that brief excursion into Libya, which I still can't understand. My guess is he probably can't understand it either, why he did that. Right? He wants a nuclear deal with Iran. Right? He thinks that's his best chance of a win in the Middle East. And I think he's probably right. That is his best chance. Right? He's not going to let Iranian regional behavior stand in the way of a nuclear deal. Now, that's not to say Washington likes Hezbollah or likes what Iran is doing in Syria. We don't. But the president privileges the nuclear deal over Iran's regional behavior. For the Saudis, Iran's regional behavior is as threatening, if not more threatening, than the nuclear issue. Now, I think the Obama administration is playing a long game here, or I think it thinks it's playing a long game. If it can do a deal with Rouhani, the new president of Iran, right, and that deal sticks, then maybe Rouhani and his guys in the Iranian domestic power structure become more powerful. And maybe they can rein in Qasem Soleimani, right, and deal and have Iran follow a more state-to-state foreign policy, not a foreign policy of clientelism and an ideological advance. Again, that's a long game. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. Right? But in fact, that inconsistency that we hear a lot about, that at least I hear a lot about when I go to the Middle East, is only inconsistent through their framework. Right? I think if you understand this administration as an administration that doesn't think the Middle East, or at least Syria, is all that important to the future of America. I mean, we can argue whether they're right or wrong, but they don't think Syria is that important. Right? And thinks that getting a nuclear deal with Iran is the most important and possible thing they can do in the region, aside from an Israeli-Palestinian deal, which is falling apart and never had much of a chance to begin with. And I still don't know why they thought that they had a chance on that. That's a whole other story. Then this administration is not consistent. It's perfectly consistent. It might not be particularly skillful in the way it creates these policies. The whole Syria business over bombing them after the chemical weapons was ugly watching that sausage getting made, right? But I actually think that you can understand this administration with just a few principles. They just don't happen to share the same principles and the same priorities that the Saudis and the Gulf states do. So, on that note, we will put up a map, because that's fun to look at, and I'm very happy to take questions. Yes, sir?
Greg, where does the prolonged Iran-Iraq war fit into your scheme?
Right. That was another age, right? The Iran-Iraq war was a fight a classic war between two relatively strong states. Went on for 8 years, ended in a tie. Stupidest war ever. Now, this is the centenary of World War I, which really was the stupidest war ever. Okay. But I think that the Iran-Iraq War qualifies stupidest war ever, Middle Eastern division. But it was a completely different framework. Just kind of classic state-to-state, big armies fighting each other. What's going on now is completely different.
Ostensibly for what at that time?
At that time, Saddam Hussein saw a revolutionary regime in Iran that he perceived was both threatening ideologically and weak because of the turmoil that revolutions cause. Well, it's both threatening and it's weak, so hit it now. What he didn't understand, and he would have understood if he had read a little bit of history, is that the one thing revolutions are really good at is mobilizing manpower for military purposes. French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, Vietnamese Revolution, all good at that. And Iran was a real revolution. So Saddam was on the defensive almost immediately in that war and held on. And the Iranians eventually got tired. Saddam used chemical weapons on them. War stops because they both get tired, basically.
We turned against.
Well, yeah, our policy in the Iran-Iraq War was very interesting. As Henry Kissinger classically said, this is the war that, I can't do a really good Kissinger, but this is the war that you wished both sides would lose. Yeah, both sides. Sorry, bad accent, bad Kissinger accent. Both sides would lose. But we saw, the Reagan administration saw Iran as slightly more threatening because of the ideological element. This idea that an Islamist revolutionary ideology spreading across the Middle East is bad, bad, bad for the U.S. Because who's the great Satan? Us. I think it was actually a perfectly understandable policy. And so we tilted towards Saddam. We gave him intelligence. We didn't object when the French sold the Iraqis oodles and oodles of arms, including Mirages. We supplied some dual-use technologies. Of course, we tried to play the other side of the street, too, Iran-Contra. We gave the Iranians some stuff, too, to try to get hostages out. Again, watching that sausage being made, no, not very edifying. Yes, sir.
If Iran had a nuclear weapon, under what circumstance would they be likely to use?
Never.
That's what I say. So
Yeah.
why is there a problem?
Because Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't believe what I believe. Look, this is a minority viewpoint. If you go to Washington and ask almost any of the great thinkers that we have coming up with strategic notions in the greatest city, the capital of the greatest power in the world, they will almost universally tell you that an Iranian nuclear weapon is a game changer. Because my understanding of this conflict is that, classical military power is actually not that important. It's your ability to develop client relations and manipulate ideological allies and play into the domestic politics of weak states in which nuclear weapons are irrelevant. I just don't think they're that important. Now, because Mr. Netanyahu disagrees with me, right, Israel has made it extremely clear that it will use military force against the Iranians to try to prevent a breakout capability. And the United States, the policy of the United States is, and the President says this all the time, we will not allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. So I've already lost this debate, okay? I've already lost it, right? Well, yeah, I pretty much have. I pretty much have. We'll see. Yeah, well, yeah, I think they've banished the use of the term red line in the Obama administration now. So what might the consequences be if the Iranians actually did go to breakout? There is a possibility of further proliferation. The Saudis have said, we'll get a weapon, right? Now, they might. They would have to get it from Pakistan because they have no domestic nuclear infrastructure. I don't think that's automatic, but it's also not impossible. Right? So, yes, the more nuclear weapons in the region, I'm not saying that's a good thing. And if we can prevent proliferation, I think that's fine. Me, I wouldn't go to war. I wouldn't use military force against Iran to prevent proliferation because A, it won't work. So you bomb some facilities, they'll rebuild them. And B, whatever debate there is in Iran right now about whether to actually try to weaponize would then be over. And they would weaponize if they were attacked. So but I want to say, this is a minority view, that if the Iranians actually weaponized, I think there would be attacks from either Washington or from the Israelis. I think
but
so.
isn't it the proliferation of the weapon? The more people have weapons, the less likely anybody's going to use them.
This is a
Like the mutually assured destruction.
right. This is political science, right? Kenneth Waltz, one of the most famous political scientists of his generation, actually wrote this in a very famous article. You know, nuclear weapons as a stabilizing force, right? Theoretically, I'm fine with it. I'm a little hinky about the practicalities. Who's going to control them? What happens if they're under the control of weak governments that are factionalized and weak? Pakistan. Do you really feel better with Pakistan having a nuclear weapon? I don't, right? Even though it's meant that Pakistan and India haven't fought a full-scale state-to-state war since they both went nuclear. They've fought little wars up in the Sichuan Glacier area in 1999. But I think the logic of your argument is very strong, makes me nervous. Yes, in the back.
So if you're portraying this as like a Cold War kind of between Iran and Saudi Arabia on either side,
Turks trying to play in, Qataris, yeah.
there's those two. I think the U.S. is definitely on the Saudi side, but you hear in the news talk about a new relationship with Iran. Do you think it's possible to have a good relationship with both of them, or do you think we have a falling out with Saudi Arabia, or is that even possible? And what would that?
Right. There's a huge, yeah, the question is, the two big players in this Cold War, Iran and Saudi Arabia. The U.S. is an ally of Saudi Arabia, but it's trying to open up a new relationship with Iran. What happens if it does? Could the U.S. and Iran make an alliance? Could the Saudis be left out? That's what the Saudis fear, okay? I think that this fear is exaggerated, right? Because even though the Obama administration isn't going to let Iranian regional behavior stand in the way of a nuclear deal that they think is good, they don't like Iranian regional behavior, right? And as long as the United States is strongly allied with Israel and Iran is strongly allied with Hezbollah, there's no way that the United States and Iran can be strategic allies, right? Also, the anti-American element of the Iranian revolutionary regime is profound. It's deep and it's ideological. It's part of Ayatollah Khomeini's legacy in the revolution. I actually don't think there's that much anti-Americanism among the Iranian public, right? But among the ruling elite of the Islamic Republican regime, anti-Americanism is an idée fixe, right? It's part of their ideological commitment. Now, if guys like Rouhani and Rafsanjani, the more pragmatic guys, get the upper hand, they'll deal with us. But General Soleimani, he's not our friend, right? The Saudis, I think, the Saudis have the typical fears of any weak state in an alliance, right? A weak state in an alliance with a stronger state, right, fears two things: entrapment and abandonment. The weak state fears that the strong state will drag it into wars it does not want to fight, get entrapped, right? This is what the Western Europeans, this is classic, this is the NATO alliance, right? This is the NATO alliance. When the United States and the Soviets were at daggers drawn, the Western Europeans feared that they would get dragged into a war that would be fought on their territory over which they had no say. Saudis, when we are really bellicose with the Iranians, like axis of evil stuff, back with George W. Bush right after 9/11, the Saudis, the thing I heard when I went to Saudi Arabia was, you're going to drag us into a war we don't want to fight. Okay? When it looks like the stronger party might be doing a deal with the adversary, the weaker parties feel they're going to be abandoned. During détente, the Western Europeans were petrified that we would basically sell out their interest to do a deal with the Soviets. And we didn't, but there were fears in that direction. And that's what the Saudis are fearing now. I think those fears are exaggerated. But that's why the president went over to Saudi Arabia to hold their hand. All right. George?
Could we turn a little bit to the question of Egypt?
Sure.
The Saudis have bought themselves a new military dictator in Egypt.
Yeah.
Two-part question, I'll let you play with them. One, how long will the Saudis be able to control him? And what will the Egyptians actually want to do with this new power?
Right. So the question is, General Sisi and the coup government in Egypt, right? The Saudis have bought themselves a new military dictator. How long will that last, and what are the Egyptians going to do with this? What is Sisi going to do with this power? Okay. Saudis don't control Sisi. You don't buy people, you rent them, right? Right? Seriously, you don't buy people, you rent them, right? The real bond is ideological, right? That's why Hezbollah is so loyal to Iran. It's not because Iran buys them. It's because they believe in Iran and they believe in the mission. Now, with that comes material support, right? But I don't think anybody would say that the material support is what drives the Hezbollah alliance with Iran. If they do, I think they're wrong. Okay? There's no love, right? There's no ideological bond between the Saudis and General Sisi. This is a marriage of convenience with a common enemy, the Muslim Brotherhood. General Sisi and people around him, encouraged by the Saudis and the Emiratis, apparently believe that they can eradicate the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't think they can. If Gamal Abdel Nasser couldn't eradicate the Muslim Brotherhood, I don't think that General Sisi can. Right? But it looks like he's going to try. The Saudis have over $700 billion in financial reserves. The 4 or 5 or 8 billion that they've committed to Egypt, there's plenty more where that came from. At some point, the Saudis will grow tired of this. Egypt is a vast hole into which you can pour enormous amounts of money. Right? There's 80 million Egyptians. And they're subsidized, every one of them, in all sorts of things, bread and gasoline and all sorts of things. You can pour enormous amounts of money into Egypt and not see much change, much economic development or whatever you want to call it. But I think for the near term, the Saudis are happy to put the, $4 billion a year, fine. That keeps the Muslim Brotherhood down, gets us a reliable ally in Cairo, fine. Now, how stable is Sisi going to be? I'm not optimistic about Sisi's future. Gamal Abdel Nasser had a party, created a political party, had an ideology. He had a vision of where he wanted Egypt to go. It was a wrong vision. It worked for a while, but it ran up against really serious economic problems at home and really serious foreign policy problems that culminated in the '67 war, a war that Nasser baited the Israelis into. Sadat had a party. He inherited Nasser's party, and he had a vision for Egypt too, a different vision. He had a notion of what it would take to change Egypt. Right? Mubarak didn't have a vision, but he had a party. Okay? Sisi doesn't have a party, doesn't have a vision. I don't think he has any idea what to do. I think it's what we're going to get is Mubarakism without Mubarak. All right? Right? The same economic policies that, while they did produce very decent economic growth numbers in Egypt, right, they also increased inequality and obviously were one of the causes for the discontent that led people into the streets in January of 2011. And even the people who benefited from the economic growth of the kind of neoliberal opening of the Egyptian economy in the 2000s, most of them didn't support the government. right? You might remember back in 2011, this Egyptian Google executive named Wael el-Ghanem became famous, at least for English-speaking audiences, because he spoke good English. He became, for us, the face of the revolution, right? Not for Egyptians. Who is this guy? But he spoke good English, and he worked for Google, and wow, that's the future. This is a guy who should have been Mubarak's best friend. This is a guy whose future in Egypt was assured by Mubarak's policies. Right? He didn't live in Egypt. He lived in Dubai, where smart, ambitious Arabs go for good jobs. Okay? But he could have come back to Egypt and gotten a great job because he's bilingual, American University in Cairo graduate, bilingual, comfortable in the international corporate culture, Google, right? Teched up, all those things. He should have been a huge supporter of Mubarak because Mubarak created an economy in Egypt where he would thrive. He was one of the leaders of the revolution against Mubarak. So this is a long, roundabout way of saying I don't know what Sisi's going to do. Right now it's the iron fist, right? He's killed like 1,500 people, probably conservative estimates, since he's come to power in this eradication campaign against the brothers. Now, this isn't Syria. It's not 150,000. But Sisi's probably killed more people in the less than a year that he's had power than Gamal Abdel Nasser did in the entire time he was in power. And Gamal Abdel Nasser was a badass dictator, right? He wasn't a nice man. He wasn't liberal, right? He put his enemies in jail. He tortured them and all. But he probably killed in the hundreds over the almost 20 years he was in power. Sisi's probably killed 1,500 people already. I don't know how far that goes. I really don't know. Sisi's probably arrested 18,000 or so people since he's come to power. So I'm not hugely optimistic of a 10-year. I don't think we're going to have any more 30-year in power guys like Mubarak. And Sisi's in charge now, but 5 years from now, I don't know. I wouldn't take a bet on him. Yes.
I was very surprised at the beginning of your talk when you described Saudi Arabia as a strong state,
Yeah.
using your
Yes.
definition. So I don't know that much about it, but I just had a sense with the monarchy and the very the way they treat the women and on and on and on, that they were more like a house of cards that would come down pretty easily.
So the Saudis, I do know a lot about them, and they're not a house of cards. We think they're a house of cards because they dress funny, right? They dress funny. They wear tablecloths on their heads, and they're not like us. Monarchies are anachronisms. Their social policies are antediluvian and just so out of touch with the modern world. Yet here they are. Arab Spring, Mubarak gone, Gaddafi gone, Ben Ali gone, civil war in Syria. Hardly a peep in Saudi, except in the Shia areas, and that's only 10% of the population. With oil at $100 a barrel, Saudis can run a pretty good patronage state, and they do, right? When the rebels in Libya dragged Gaddafi out of the drainage ditch and killed him, tortured him and killed him, he had like $80 billion in the bank. The king of Saudi Arabia, at the beginning of the Arab Spring, said, I'm going to spend $136 billion right now on you. Everybody's salary goes up. Going to build a lot of houses. I'm going to give more money to education. I'm going to give more money to the religious stuff. I'm going to give more money. Saudis aren't going to go to bed. Saudis aren't going to get dragged out of the drainage ditch with lots of money in the bank. It's not to say that this place doesn't have problems, right? The leadership is ancient. No offense. The king is like 91. Yeah, I see. It's spring chicken. The crown prince is 77 or 78. And this generation is running out. Okay? This generation is running out. But, you know, the guy next to the crown prince, the deputy crown prince now, he's been declared, is only 71. Real spring chicken. Okay? So maybe there's another 10 years in this generation, but at some point the Saudis have got to go from this generation of half-brothers down to their sons. And that's going to be a hard transition. Yeah, well, you know, some of them are already dying. And of course, that family is so huge that some of the nephews are older than their uncles, right? Right? The Minister of Education, the former governor of Mecca, Khalid al-Faisal, son of King Faisal, right? Big-time figure in Saudi history, is older than his uncle, Prince Mukrin, who is the deputy crown prince, okay? So when the family lines up, where does Khalid say? Does he stand in front of? No, because Mukrin is the crown prince. And yeah, you're right. It's because the family's so huge, it's got these messy elements. But that's why the king appointed this guy Mukrin as deputy crown prince. He wants to avoid that messy shift down. I think if the Saudis have a problem, it's going to be from the top, not the bottom, if they split over succession. Now, obviously, if oil prices collapse because of some big technological change in the world economy, then the Saudis are also in big trouble, but then we won't care, right? Because, you know, if we don't need the oil, then we won't care. And I'll go and write a book about it because it'll be interesting, but you won't have me here to talk about it because nobody will care. Yes, ma'am?
What's it going to take for to get down to the generations where women have more power and can even drive their own cars?
Right. The only place in the Middle East, the only place in the world where women are not allowed to drive cars is Saudi Arabia, right? And it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, but this has become the symbolic issue for the religious establishment, for the religious, kind of the guys in between, and it's the one issue that unites the state-appointed clerics and Al-Qaeda, right? It has become the symbolic issue of we are not going to let the Westerners tell us how to treat our women, right? And so the king is not, the one thing this king, people say King Abdullah has been a reformer. Not really. He's been extremely cautious, very little political reform, and in fact, since the Arab Spring, a crackdown on what little political freedoms there were. The one area where Abdullah actually has made some social changes that will have a lasting impact is in women. He's allowed women to take up these scholarships, which wasn't possible before, to go and study abroad. He has appointed women to the not that powerful consultative assembly, the appointed legislature, but he has appointed women, and so now they're equally powerless with the men, but they're in there. They're in there, okay? He has permitted women a greater role in public life, in the public sphere. And I don't think that can be rolled back so easily. But the driving issue really is this kind of symbolic. If Social Security is the third rail of American politics, the women's driving issue is the third rail of Saudi politics. And I don't think this king is going to touch it. But more generally, you know, the rise of Islamist politics, Sunni, Shia, Muslim Brotherhood, Salafi, it's all over the Middle East, right? It's the age of Islamist politics. And Islamist groups just have a very different notion of the public role of women than we do. They just do. Let me go back here, and then here, and then here. Sir.
Are there any countries in this region that are better suited to beyond oil as a big factor in their economies? Are there any states that are technologically advanced or setting themselves up the way Norway has with their sovereign funds?
Oh, all these guys have sovereign funds, but I don't know if they're setting themselves up for a post-oil future. I mean, the nice thing about Norway is it had a pre-oil past, right? And it was a democracy before oil came. right? And so it avoided a lot of the pathologies, the political pathologies that come with great oil wealth. Look, you can read the propaganda in Dubai or Qatar about knowledge, creating knowledge societies and all. Dubai actually has diversified into a post-oil tourist entrepot economy, trade center, all that kind of thing. It's a vibrant place. Ambitious, smart, internationally oriented Arabs want to work in Dubai. The Israelis have a pretty good economy, high tech, right? Export oriented. They're not socialist any longer, right? The Turks, despite the political crisis of the last months, the Turks have done a remarkable job in the last 15 years in turning their economy around, to the extent that they are the 17th largest economy in the world right now, I believe. Turkey has had really substantial economic growth. It's benefited. It's not an EU member, but it's in the European Free Trade Association. So the Turks can sell their products in the EU, the largest market in the world, on the same basis as EU members, i.e. no tariffs. And Turkish industry has taken advantage of that. So Turkey has done a pretty good job economically. The Arab Spring's been disastrous economically, right? Tourism, which is so important in Egypt and Tunisia, it's down. Political instability, who's going to invest in a place that's politically unstable? The least of serious problems right now is economic growth. I mean, they're in a horrific civil war. Libya is an oil state that can't export oil because the government can't control its own oil facilities. It's a pretty sorry sight. Yes, ma'am, here. Yes, ma'am.
If Iran could push Netanyahu over the red line, would then the United States come to Israel's aid?
Yeah, sure. Of course we will. I think. Yeah.
I'd like to hear your thoughts about what are or should be our priorities and interests that would form a more coherent and intelligent foreign policy. And in that context, I would be curious about your looking at economics as well as ideology, as well as security. I was struck last night, there was a story about how Exxon is now partnering with the big Russian oil firm to open up leases, I think, in the Gulf of Mexico, and the question was raised, so how is Exxon going to want to influence national policy towards Russia? Mm-hmm. So are there